First thing I'm going to do when the boat comes out of the water is look for blisters. The reason you want to do that right away is blisters will tend to go down and become invisible as the boat dries out. So as you can see, I have several of these small, about 1/4 to 1/2 inch diameter blisters, and those are blisters in the barrier coat. I applied a 2-part Interlux epoxy barrier coat back in 2008. And about every year when I haul out, I'll get about a dozen or so of these small blisters. And so for now, we're just going to pop them open and rinse them with a little fresh water and let them dry out. This year we're going to take the mast out. It's been 5 years since it was last out, and it's a wooden mast. So generally every 5 years it's good to pull the mast out, lay it down, remove the hardware, and give it a careful inspection, as well as strip the varnish off and re-varnish it. But first we got to take the bowsprit off. So right now I got my head up in the chain locker. I have to undo 4 nuts which are attached to the bolts which hold a strap at the heel of the bowsprit, which we're going to have to remove in order to remove the bowsprit. So here we are back up on deck, and right now I'm working on the gammon iron, and there's 4 carriage bolts that hold that top plate where the forestay is attached. And so right now I'm just trying to work those bolts out, giving a little tap with the hammer there, and I'm just trying to wiggle it loose. And I've gotten the upper plate to move up a little bit just so I can get the claw of the hammer under it and just gently use the claw of the hammer there. And here we go again. And there it goes. So we got the gammon iron apart. And then it's back to that strap that I undid the nuts to earlier underneath. So now I'm just going to get those 4 bolts out. And after that, I've already removed the whisker stays and the bob stay. So now the bowsprit should come off. And I have the jib halyard attached out to the krantz iron at the end of the bowsprit so the thing won't tumble off the boat. And I'm going to use that jib halyard to pick it up. So we'll do a little test here. Whoop. Something's still stuck. It doesn't want to move. So, a few more taps. Yeah, whoops. Looks like it moved there. Give it a heave. There we go. So it looks like we can pick the bowsprit up now. Now this bowsprit, whoa, weighs about 80 pounds. And it's a little tricky. Because once you pick it up out of its place, it'll tend to swing to one side or another. So I'm going to use the halyard to hold one end and then basically just horse the thing back on deck. It's always a bit of a delicate exercise. So then once I have it back on the foredeck, then I'm just going to pick it up with the halyard and gently lower it over the side onto the ground. And again, just being careful not to ding up my cap rail, put any dents in anything. So just easy does it. So the men have arrived to pull the mast out. The crane is in place, and I've de-rigged her all the way down to the 4 lowers. So they just had to detach those and attach the crane and pull it up and out. Back in 2002, I applied Spartite at the Partners, which is the place where the mast goes down through the cabin top. And I remember the first time I tried to pull the mast out after using Spartite. The Spartite would not let it go, and I ended up having to drill holes down through the Spartite. And I also inadvertently drilled holes in the mast, so I later had to put a few scarfs there. But since then, the Spartite is mainly just worked as a wedge to hold the mast in place, and then I use a traditional canvas boot to keep it from leaking. After the first pull, the mast has always come out fairly easily with the Spartite, and the Spartite ring is still attached to the mast when it came out this time. So now we have to disentangle all the rigging and remove all the rigging. And we'll start first with the running rigging and then move on to the wire standing rigging. Now all the rigging on this mast is attached to those bronze bands you see, which are basically just big clamps. There's two sets of bolts on either side, and you just tighten the bolts, and the bronze rings clamp to the mast. And I just removed the top one. That's where the jib stay and the two upper shrouds are attached. And then down to the second band where the running backstays and the jib halyard attach. And so on, all the way down till we have removed all the bands and all the hardware from the mast. And once we've done this, then we can move on to our inspection of the mast. So as you can see right away, I found a couple of opened up seams there. This mast may look like a solid piece of wood, but it's not. It's several pieces of Douglas fir that are all glued together. And over time, occasionally the glue begins to fail and seams open up. And I found two of those, one right here that I'm working on, and then another one on the opposite side of the mast just further up. And I also found one small spot of rot just above the spreaders. So I just cleaned it out and put some epoxy in there. It's small such that it will not require a scarf or a Dutchman or anything glued in there. Just the epoxy will do. So the way I'm going to fix this is, as you can see, I cleaned it out with the saw and the sandpaper. And then I built a little sort of trough with tape there. And so I'm going to use the syringe tool and just inject West epoxy in there. And also build up some epoxy into that trough, just so that the force of gravity will build up some pressure that'll push that epoxy deep down into the seams. And epoxy is a gap filler. Unlike traditional wood glues, you don't have to have the wood, the two pieces of wood actually joining. The epoxy will fill the gap and form a bond. And next we're going to beef up some of the anti-chafe bands on the mast, and I'm going to use fiberglass roving and epoxy. And this is where the gaff butts up against the mast. And I have a band for the mainsail fully set, and then the first reef. Then I'm also going to add a band at the second reef because I was getting some chafe there where the gaff was digging into the varnish and into the wood. So the epoxy and roving makes a nice smooth surface for it to join up against the mast. And so I'm just pour some epoxy on the roving there, and then begin spreading it around with our little roller, and just working the epoxy all the way through the roving. And the trick is to get that roving completely wetted out. And that's probably the trickiest part I find of doing any kind of epoxy fiberglassing work. is avoiding areas, white spots where the epoxy didn't completely wet out the roving. So now we start in on the bottom, and I'm going to wet sand the bottom with 80 grit wet or dry sandpaper. I prefer to wet sand than dry sand because it keeps the dust down. And also you can spray the sanding block, the sandpaper, with the hose there, like I'm doing right now, and it'll get the residue out of the sandpaper, so your sandpaper lasts longer. And of course, it's a difficult job because you're always sanding on a surface that's above you, so you're fighting gravity at the same time. And usually getting under the keel there at some point involves laying down in a mud pit, so it's great fun. So I'm going to paint the entire hull, and so first I have to remove all the name and the hail, the lettering, and also the gold shear stripe. And I'm going to wet sand the top sides as well. As you can see, I picked a perfect day for wet sanding. I got plenty of water everywhere. So that was the first cut there. I used 150 wet sand. And before I put the first coat of paint on, I'll give it another go over with 220 because the 150 is too coarse, and the scratches will show up right through the finish. So I'll go to 220, and then usually up to 320 before the final finish. So we got a nice sunny day, and the top sides are all sanded, so time to put on the first coat of paint. I use Brightside polyurethane, which is made by Interlux. It's a one-part modified polyurethane paint, and I'm going to apply it with a 3-inch badger hair brush. I don't think the bristles are actual badger hairs. I believe they're synthetic, but it's essentially a high-quality varnish brush where you have a good density of bristles, and so you can work the paint out and get a good finish. As you can see, the sun is shining on this on the hull on this side, and that makes painting quite difficult because you see I just moved the ladder there. So now I'm going to apply paint to a new patch, and then it's going to have to meet up with the paint I've already applied. And the problem is when the hull heats up and you have the sun on it, is that paint edge will start to cure on you. And so you'll see where the two spots of paint join, and it may not level out and will give a poor finish. The way you counteract that with Interlux paints is to add 333, the brushing liquid. It's a thinner, and that will definitely slow the curing, the drying down. But the problem is if you apply too much thinner, you will not get a gloss. And we have a very nice gloss here, but that's fresh paint, and this is only the first coat. Generally, the gloss, most of that gloss will go flat on just the first coat, and it's going to require more, usually 3 or 4 coats to get a decent gloss. So when the guy ran over my dinghy, it seems either he ricocheted off the dinghy or maybe got caught in the painter. And he struck the boat off the starboard quarter and also struck the rudder head and caused the damage you see there in the picture. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is to carve out a wedge shaped indent in the wood there, which I can then make a scarf out of a piece of wood, piece of teak, and glue in there. So in order to carve this wedge out, as you saw, I scribed the edges of it with my awl, and now what I'm doing is I'm using my cross-cut saw, and I'm going to cut down to those scribed marks. And then after that I'm going to use my wood chisel and chisel out the wood between the saw cuts, and that'll yield the wedge-shaped indent that I'm looking for. Which is shown right here. So that's a nice clean shape, and I can then make a scarf or a Dutchman, a piece of wood to glue in there. So now I'm going to work on making the scarf, or the Dutchman, and I'm actually using the teak from the outboard motor bracket to the nutshell pram, which is no more, so I don't need that bracket anymore. And right now I'm using my hacksaw as a crosscut saw. And now I have my chisel and just gently knocking it with the hammer there and using it to knock off the excess, the wastage between the saw cuts. And then finally, right here I'm going to use my bevel plane. And that's to get the two sides of the scarf nice and flat. And those are the two sides that are going to go into the indent we made in the rudder head. And a pretty good fit. We still got a little more work to do, but it's definitely shaping up, and we'll be ready to glue pretty soon.